thanks for that. I think there needs to be a little bit of a um, contesting of views on this topic, and what I would what I would like to I'd just like to make a few contesting points, particularly about some of the things that Cathy said, and I think the issue of things like Cambridge Analytica is certainly very serious and certainly worth paying attention to. But there are a few points I think. So, firstly, the fellow at Google who has pioneered a lot of the use of Google search data for social research, that's Seth Stevens Davidowitz. He was asked point blank, "Do you think that Cambridge Analytica influenced the election?" He said no. And why would it be that Cambridge Analytica would come out and say they did? Well, because they're a company and they're selling something, right? At a very great cost, I'm sure. There were two contenders for that election, only two because it's a two-party system, and it was a very close race. So it's essentially a coin toss. Mm-hmm. For all we know, maybe they were even working for both sides. And they came out and said, look, we swung the election. Look how valuable we are. People should pay us a lot of money. Well, of course, they're very biased in saying that. And I think a lot of this rests upon some sort of questionable science. So, for example, personality testing has a pretty poor track record in general. So things like Briggs-Myers, which you didn't mention, but that's sort of out of date and debunked. There are big problems with reproducibility in psychology itself. Now, maybe big data is going to change all that, but the history of it is not very good. One of the most reproducible results in psychology is that most of the results in psychology are not reproducible. So, for example, one of the big problems in the human and social sciences right now is the misuse and misunderstanding of statistics, and there's a crisis with the concept of p-values, which almost nobody's talking about. But so a lot of this argument about the prowess of Cambridge Analytica rests on this idea of the prowess of the human and social sciences, where there are big, undiscussed, very broad problems. Another example is priming, which was said to be going to influence elections. They said we figured out how we can, show people words or pictures or whatever, and we can influence their voting patterns. Well, that collapsed. That was not reproducible just in the last few years. So that's another example. And Johnny and Eva's research group at Stanford, which specializes in doing research into the process of research in the biomedical and behavioral sciences, has shown very clear biases in behavioral sciences. And the more behavioral they get, the more biased they get away from any kind of true underlying average set of real measured values that are purported to be there. And the reason why I care about this is because, to me, it's very clear that even if Cambridge Analytica had some influence on the election, the real issue underlying Brexit and the US election is this ever-growing class war in the West between essentially the middle class, which has become very much cognitive workers, and this sort of growing, you can't even call them working class anymore because the West doesn't make anything anymore. It doesn't do anything anymore. And a large part of these cognitive workers' jobs is to justify why they shouldn't be poor and why other people should, or to manage poor people. And so this, without it has to, I think this contesting position has to be put forward, because otherwise, this analysis is just investing in this sort of mythical belief in this prowess of people who can understand and predict people and society, when the evidence is at least up until very recently, maybe we don't know about big data, but up until very recently, is very poor. And so it's investing in the problem. It's a static majoritarianism, in a sense. So that was the point I wanted to make. I think there is a massive class war in the West, and that is actually what is really germane to the American election and Brexit, between the middle class and the poor in the West.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you, and I think that, I mean, that's, I mentioned emergent correlations, so one never really knows what's going to come out of big data. But I also mentioned garbage in, garbage out, and I had a lot of problems with Cambridge Analytica. I also went on to actually talk about other things that I didn't get that far in my talk, that influenced the American elections. So, you know, the Podesta leaks, um, um, Pizzagate, which was a citizen journalism thing, but it was terribly damaging. James Comey's timing in terms of opening up the investigation on Hillary as well. I think she's completely in denial. And she also said that there was nothing incriminating in those leaks, and that wasn't the case. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you that this is a class thing. It is, and we are possibly coming to a future, not only a class thing, but I do have contempt myself for how much faith is placed in these so-called magicians, um, the data crunchers. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I really fear that that's where we're going in the future. You know, we're going to have two classes. We're going to have a technological class, and then we're going to have everybody else. And if we don't get UBI in the meantime, the arts have almost perished already. Um, we won't have all this actual diversity. One can predict, maybe Cambridge Analytica can even predict, that things are going to get, pretty boring and desperate.
Just to add to that, so in terms of the psychology stuff, I absolutely agree. Part of the problem with, oops, sorry, that's my alarm for the bins. So part of the problem is that we don't have a good explanatory theory of personality. There is none. There's the attempt to detect various traits, shall we call them, like the OCEAN. I don't think they're totally missing the point, like as in, I think that we hit on some sort of truth in that, but they're not really explanatory. They don't tell us how these traits evolve from neurons or from someone's consciousness or things like that. They're just an assertion that they exist, and let's attempt to measure them. Here's some questions we think might measure them. But the reality is that things like split testing, where you give a slightly different website to two different people who come on, and you measure things like, you link it to Facebook so you can see the things they like, you can correlate all that data. And even when you don't have good explanatory theories, you can do a lot with just dumb correlation. It's the difference between biological evolution and human engineering, right? Human engineering always wins out. We can make cars or planes or rocket ships. Biological evolution has never done that. But biological evolution does make creatures that fly, it does make creatures that swim, it does do all this sort of other stuff. It's not an intelligent way of making progress, it's very slow, but it does make progress. And I think that's what our current things like machine learning, like data analytics, all that sort of stuff, that's what it's hitting into, right? Is that it's finding little ways to move forward. Like the guy who was, Monsoir Nix, who was talking before, he spoke about having like a 10 to 20% swing rate in various things, in key identified areas, changing people's, persuading on that sort of percentage. Now, if they actually had a really good idea of what they were doing, I would expect it to be way higher, right? The idea of changing things by maybe 8% on a good day means that you're not really hitting great milestones. You're hitting something, but it's not like you have insight that is, not able to be obtained by anyone else. It's not like you have some deep breakthrough in psychology. And ultimately, I think that's probably good. If they did have some deep breakthrough in psychology and kept it private, then they'd have a lot more power than they do now. And that would be bad. Whether they actually did swing the election or not is something that we can never really know. We can't test the negative as such. We can't run a controlled trial in an alternate universe where Cambridge Analytica didn't exist. That would be nice. But yeah, so I mean, it's all of this sort of stuff is very, very hypothetical. Whether it matters or not is questionable. How far it's going to come in the future is also questionable. It's dependent on a lot of psychological research, and absolutely psychological research right now is really terrible. A p-value of 0.5 is laughable, frankly, from a scientific point of view. Yes, yeah. Well, particularly, I mean, and it's the other thing where psychologists will continue doing trials until they get a result, right? Not understanding the nature of statistics being that, like, p-values don't work if you keep adding samples until you just random walk down to the right p-value to publish a study, which is, of course, why they're unreproducible. The main problem with psychology is they don't have explanatory theories behind them. Anyway, we can talk more about that later. That goes deeply into philosophy as well. Sorry, that was a bit longer than I intended.
Yeah, you to have the majority, the management committee of politics in the pub. Thank you for your talk, very informative. Yeah, this is great. Okay, Richard Robinson, Vice President of Cambridge Analytica's commercial arm, recently bragged that influencing somebody's vote, quote, is no different to persuading somebody to move from one toothpaste brand to another. And the London School of Economics, in response to the Brexit vote, has come out with a comment. New technology has disrupted British politics so much that current laws are visibly unable to ensure a free and fair election of any type, or indeed control the influence of big money in politics. They go on to ask, what does this mean for democracy? And is our electoral process still fit for purpose? They talk about perhaps banning or legislating against micro-targeting techniques, or whether the progressive side of politics should adopt similar tactics to use big data in the interest of promoting progressive political causes. You mentioned that a political monoculture and a static majoritarianism favours big data, and that the solution is a polyculture and a dynamic majoritarianism. How do we get to that point? Because certainly the ruling economic corporate elites favour the existing democracy because it works in their interests. So how do we make that change?
So, okay, on making the change, over time, there are a number of trends that have become apparent through surveys and things like this. One of them is that people become less satisfied with democracy. What that means is that we have an in, essentially, is that if we can provide something that's more satisfactory in terms of outcomes, then we might be able to begin to sway people to a better system. Part of the problem right now is that there's this meme, this idea within politics that you have to vote for the lesser of two evils. Now, I'd say that the bigger evil is voting for either of them, because that's only enforcing, that meme, that idea, that stagnation. And so it's just much better to start experimenting, even if you seem like you're throwing your vote away. Of course, we have a preferential system, so that's not the case, but many people feel like that. Basically, the way to move forward is to, in any way, start using alternative political systems. If we can create a political system that favors knowledge over opinion, for example, that favors understanding, that favors like things that are objectively true as opposed to just stuff that people believe, populism. If we can create a system like that, it doesn't matter where we start it, because it should spread. It should be so economically advantageous, so philosophically advantageous, right? It should have so many other benefits to us in whatever context we started in, right, provided that's appropriate. Those benefits should become apparent. And as those benefits become apparent, that means that the opportunity cost for everyone else not adopting that sort of system become larger and larger.
Wouldn't the corporate economic elite resist it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If they, I mean, and it doesn't matter if they're corporate economic elites or if it's an oligarchy or whatever else, right? If there are people in power, they want to maintain it. But the reality of being in power is that you want to take as few people with you as possible, right? The more people you take with you when you enter into power means the further you have to spread resources, right? The less you can do what you want to do, and the more you have to appease other people, right? This essentially just comes back to economics in the sense that imagine that there are, you only need 5 of these special people to hold political power, and you've got 7 of their support, right? Someone else comes along and finds 5 of those 7 special people and says, hey, look, if you support me, then I'm going to just kill the other 2 and give you all the treasure that I was previously giving them. Right, this is obviously a simplification and analogous to a dictatorship, but if we imagine that scenario, right, this is how a coup happens, is that someone comes along and they convince the smallest possible majority needed to maintain power that they'll benefit them, possibly they lie to others as well, that they later kill or disown or whatever else, and then they take power, right? So when you're entering into power, you want as small a group of supporters as you need to maintain power. You don't want to go over the top, because if you go over the top, you need to spread yourself thinly, right? What that means, when we enter into a complex society, where we have lots of businesses, lots of interests, lots of different ideas, lots of different areas of policy, it becomes harder and harder and harder to maintain that interest, because you have to spread it between more and more and more parties. Now, when we're thinking about a single political party with a single policy platform that they need to be public about, that becomes very difficult, becomes very restricting. They need to focus on what's going to appease their key supporters at the time. But is it possible that there's another system that is able to adopt more key supporters, that's able to enfranchise more people without corrupting itself? And if it is possible to have a system like that, a system that is overall more beneficial to more people, then we can start to grow that. There are many, many groups in Australia and the world who are not enfranchised by the current political systems, who are left out. On most of the issues I care about, I'm left out. There are very few issues that I vote on that I actually care about. There are some. And I think that that's true of pretty much everyone. So if we can come up with a system that enables that level of specialization, that enables that level of tailoring and engagement and freedom and parallelism, that enables different issues to progress at different rates without being tied to one central political philosophy and the compromise that comes with that. If we can find a system like that, which of course I propose IBDD is, but there might be other ones, that's fine. And I might be wrong about IBDD, like I could be disastrously wrong. But those properties, I think, are the important properties, is being able to work in parallel, work with different groups, be specialized. Those are the sorts of things that enable us to move from our current form of political system into a new form of political system that is ultimately far more beneficial to the individual. Now, what that ultimately means in terms of moving forward in Australia is we probably need to find about 10% of one state that is really pro one idea. And if we can get them, or a group that are pro an ecosystem of ideas that aren't too contradictory, and if we can get them all to vote for a proxy party that implements a system of democracy that has all those properties I just talked about, then we've got one representative. And that's the hardest part. As soon as we have that, right, if the system that either I describe or someone else comes up with, if that's really beneficial, then that'll start showing. Right now, there are other ways to experiment with this other than just parliamentary democracy. There are other ecosystems to govern and things like that, and we might be able to experiment there when it's appropriate. But basically, that's the first step. Once we get there, right, if any system is truly better, then it's going to have all of those other benefits. It's going to be economically advantageous. It's going to push their ideas further. It's going to enable more synergy between different groups. It's going to enable, essentially, people who are disenfranchised to have some enfranchisement. And if we can do that, then that's the first step. Once we do that, you do that for another group and another group and another group and so on, right? we've got less satisfaction with democracy now than we've ever had before. And so if we can just make that first step, the first step is the hardest. Once we've made that, then it just becomes a snowball effect of other people signing on. Now, again, maybe Flux and issue-based direct democracy isn't the right way to go. That's totally possible. But what we've got right now is definitely not the right way to go. Anyway, sorry, that was yeah, again, longer than I intended, but I hope that answered the question.
I wish the whole place had been full of people, because I think this is really one of the most important politics in the pub that we've actually had, is to talk about, you know, what's really wrong, what is stopping progress. And I wish my partner had been here. She's really concentrating on global warming, and she does a radio show for 3CR in Melbourne on global warming, and we're going absolutely nowhere with it. We're going in other. Okay, my own thoughts. My thoughts on the global warming issue, why we're going nowhere, why it will destroy us, is the amount of media concentration. In the English-speaking world, it's Murdoch that owns the presses, owns all the technology, a lot of it, and that's where no progress is happening. In non-English-speaking background countries, often they don't have Murdoch, and often they do have proportional representation. And I think that's important. And that goes towards the issue-based politics that you're talking about. So I've done a little bit of thinking about it, but it's sort of not got very far. And that's why I'm very grateful for your, thank you. Very grateful for what you were saying this evening. Media concentration, yeah, selling Green Left Weekly. So I go down to the tunnel under Friday afternoons, evenings, selling with other people the Green Left Weekly, because people should be fed up with reading all Murdoch's stuff. Turns out they walk straight past. A good 99% of people do walk straight past. And that's a good reality check for me, because people's hearts aren't bursting with dissatisfaction and being fed up with being fed rubbish, and would maybe like some alternative rubbish, or the Green Left Weekly at least, or even taking a free brochure. They're just not interested, and I just wonder why this is. Okay, if I can just mention a bloke called John Briggs, or Biggs, I think. He wrote for the Tasmanian Times. He says, why Scandinavia has got it right and we've got it wrong. A really good article that was on proportional representation. Much harder to play the system as Cambridge Analytica is doing, I believe. And also, where my wife has lived, Switzerland, where they have citizens-initiated referenda. I wonder if you've thought about this. And maybe it doesn't go as far as what you're saying, but goes in that direction. So thank you very much, and please do buy the Green Left Weekly. Don't walk past us in the tunnel. Thank you very much for this evening.
Well, it's rather loud. There's two things I'd like to comment on. But first one is media concentration. And the second one is about Iceland. I'll take it in reverse order. So what you need to do is keep your eyes on Iceland. After the GFC, the people of Iceland got together and wrote the world's first people's constitution. And that was very befitting, because Iceland was where the first parliament ever was created 900 years ago. So this is a system. They're still representatives, but the constitution has been entirely crowdsourced and discussed, 1,000 people in a room, and then cleaned up by people who were professional constitution writers, if you like, lawyers, but they weren't allowed to have anything to do with banks, big business, or anything like that. So I don't know if you know, but last December there were elections in Iceland just before I was there, just before the Trump victory. So we expected that the Pirate Party might do rather well. And those elections came up because the Prime Minister of Iceland and his wife were named in the Panama Papers. Now, there was one other person that was named in the Panama Papers, and he was the leader of the Independence Party, who were at the center of the right-wing coalition that got in. And in fact, there was a scandal, actually. I don't need to go into the details, but the government has collapsed again. And so the Iceland are going to most likely to have elections again before the end of the year. And it greatly surprised me that the president of the parliament asked the independents of the coalition, can we bring in the people's constitution before the parliament is dissolved? So this people's constitution needs to be brought in over 2 successive governments, the first one to introduce, the second for the period of ratification. Yeah. So in fact, if all goes well and that happens, and then a left-wing coalition gets voted in before the end of the year, we could see the world's first entirely people-drafted constitution come in Iceland. So I think that's something that you should take a look at. Incredible social safety net, great on education. Yeah, it's very good. The other thing you talked about was concentration of media. And I think the thing that you know that has really changed in this world is that everybody can publish now. Andy Warhol said they're 15 minutes of fame, but you know we're in it for good, and I think we need to be very, very careful that we don't. This is a very powerful tool because you are influencing others all the time, and in fact, one of the very significant things that brought Hillary down was the fake news network. So we have to be very careful as citizens who publish, who author things, who influence others, that we are not co-opted by those above us who can enlist us for their causes. I think the first wave of citizen journalism, which was inspired by WikiLeaks, was really on the right track, because it had a very, very high degree of reliability. But we have to be very careful now that it doesn't turn into total chaos. Media is not concentrated around Murdoch, even though he's still got lots of money and printing lots of things, still in a bit of trouble. But what's published most in this world is the things that citizens publish. Yes, Jefferson.
Without, is this on? Can
Yep.
you hear?
Yep.
Without particularly want to delving into the world of being a Luddite from the old world, I will remind you that it is the centenary of the Russian Revolution this month, and Karl Marx once said that the history of all societies is the history of classes and the history of class struggle. And you have the productive means, the means of production and the productive forces interacting to produce 2 classes, one who owns the means of production and one who slaves away. Now, while I admire this idea that we are now all journalists and we are now all connected to the internet, there is such a thing as state power that still exists. You only have to look at China, where they control which internet channels you can and can't go onto, or Australia or any other country. So, well, my question is really, are you really saying that class society, where the ruling class give us Tweedledum and Tweedledee to vote for, the rulers of this society are willingly going to accept a democratisation not only of the media through self-individual expression, but also hand over all their wealth as a result of it? So, you know, this is what I'm throwing up. What are the roadblocks that maybe you haven't considered to overcoming the state power that exists, that will not willingly relinquish power, apart from saying, oh, we can undermine them by getting control of this big data and shifting it in the direction of the way we want to go, surely they're just going to chop off communications when you start to threaten them in a real way.
Just out of curiosity, was that directed at Cathy or I at that point?
Well, it was a philosophical question that I would like to ask you. Just because it's Labor and Liberal and Greens now doesn't mean that the ruling class will be abolished if you suddenly have 45 different parties.
No, absolutely, absolutely.
Components of society will rub you out as quick as possible if you become a threat with your new high-tech technology.
That sounds like it's directed at me right there. Okay. This is absolutely a threat to them, right? If we presume that there is a political elite, which data points to the fact that there probably is, then and we can identify, plenty of people in that regard. The question becomes, to what extent does their power actually influence things, right? To what extent can they change stuff, or at what point does that begin becoming self-harm? Now, one of the things about one of the massive benefits about being a democracy is that the basis of power is leveraged from the productivity of the people. Right, in a dictatorship, then often that's not the case. It's the natural resources that the state holds, or it's simply stealing from farmers and selling it on the free market for a ridiculously high markup, things like that. But in a democratic society, if there is a malevolent ruling class, then their hands are very much tied by how their actions influence the productivity of people. If they were to destroy the productivity of the people from which they try to raise taxes and things like that, then they would destroy their own power. And so there are natural limits within that sort of construct. If they go too far, for example, if they cut off the internet, then not only would many, many businesses worth billions of dollars individually, let alone combined, be very angry, right, which is, of course, part of their power base under this construction, not only would that destroy a lot of their ability to both raise revenue and hold power, but it would also convince a lot of people that they were pure evil and stupid.
All I can say is Google, Netflix, Facebook, and the rest of them are getting richer and richer, and we are getting poorer and poorer, and the 10 billionaires now own the equivalent of half the rest of the world's population, and it's accelerating. And to my way of thinking, the only thing that's going to reverse it is the total destruction of the planet through climate change. And I don't think a few billion people saying, hey, whiz-bang, let's use high-tech whizzery to change the social relations of our society, because you've got this illusion that we live in a democracy. I'm sorry, we don't. We live in a class society where the wealthy are getting wealthier and the poor are getting poorer. You might have a nice, cluey job, mate, but I've been unemployed for 30 years. Thank you.
So, in regards to the first half, I think I disagree with most of it. We live in a very shit democracy, but it's a democracy nonetheless. And if you ask anyone who lived under Nazi Germany or the USSR or anything else, then I'm sure they will agree. The US might not feel like the last bastion of freedom, but by God, they fucking really try to keep that. And even if they make mistakes, they're like, Oh, look, again, don't doubt they're making mistakes. They are. No, no, absolutely it's a decision, but all decisions have the capability to be mistakes or not be mistakes. Most of the time, until we investigate that, we can't tell whether they're mistakes or not.
Sorry, I was playing Dorothy Dix. I'm not attacking you personally. I'm just saying that there are standard accepted understandings in this group about how society is structured. You've come at it from an entirely different perspective, and I respect you for that. But I'm just hoping and praying that your method works. But I have doubts. That's all I'm really saying.
That's
So please don't think I'm attacking.
No, that's totally okay. I think both criticism and conjecture are incredibly important. I'm coming up here with an idea that hasn't been well tested, that is from a totally different point of view, and that both gives it incredible potential and also the incredible potential for being a massive mistake. Now, what I'd say is far more foundational than my idea is just the idea that we try new things at all. Because everything that we've tried in the past has failed. You know, we've got, and this is the classic Winston Churchill, the least worst form of democracy type thing. Every other system we've tried hasn't been as successful. Now that by no means indicates that there isn't a more successful system out there, right? There has to be a more successful system out there. But what matters, if we want to find that, is the most important thing is experimentation. Now, that doesn't mean that my idea is the best, that doesn't mean that anyone else's idea is the best. It means that trying new ideas is far more important than going with the old way. That's the one thing I'd argue above all other things, is that if we don't experiment, we will die. That's just it. We need to try new things, we need to make progress. Cool. I'll leave it there then. Wrap up. Oh yeah.
Look, I really admire your novel approach. It really is new, and I hope it works. But you describe you know it's a really good thing. Something really new and positive. But you're saying that the current system doesn't work. Well, it doesn't work for a lot of people, but for the ruling class, it works. It put them there. It keeps them there. It made them rich. It keeps them rich, and they're getting richer. It works totally for them. They don't want it. The only way they want to change it, like every now and then they have a new variation on it, like managerialism or whatever. The only time they change is to make it work better for them. And it works perfectly for them. It's not a mistake for them. It's absolutely, totally the right thing for them, but not for the masses.
So I'd challenge that from the first by saying that it's made us rich too, as in, I only make $70,000 a year. Well, I own the business that pays me $70,000 a year, but I make $70,000 a year at the moment. I have an iPhone. I can make international flights. That's both of those things. I mean, 10 years ago, iPhones were just invented. 100 years ago, no one could travel internationally in 24 hours. Like, we have a society that is far richer than any society has ever existed before. And the reality is that Western societies are far richer than other societies, and I think that's largely to do with their values around freedom, around openness to conjecture, around openness to ideas, openness to science, things like that. That's what's enabled us to develop more wealth, right? Wealth being the ability to change our environment, which... So the challenge to that, the challenge to that is that fewer people as a percentage are born into absolute poverty than have ever been born into absolute poverty before. Right. Yeah, it's about 10% of the world currently. Yeah, no, it's like, that's things we've measured. Like, when we talk about the wealth of the average person globally, right, when we compare it to the richest people, then maybe that's going down. But the reality is that the living standard of the average person in the world is going up. Right, their access to technology, to healthcare, to things like that, it's not great, don't get me wrong, right? It's nowhere near us, but it's getting better, and what matters more than, I think, for me at least, more than anything else, is that has to keep getting better, right? As in, we need to prioritize human flourishing, and not just human flourishing in the West, human flourishing globally. We need to prioritize that above everything else. Right, that's the thing that's going to make the rest of the world rich. It's like, and the reality of being wealthy in this way is that when the more people are able to access education, access things like technology and smartphones and products and engineering and the ability to manufacture things and whatever else, the more people that have access to that, the faster we all grow. Right, the more people who have access to design new things, then the more ability we have as a species to access new technology, to produce new things. And so, I think not only are we getting better on the whole, we're also getting better faster. We're also, the one caveat here, we're also becoming far more aware of the disparity between wealth, right, in a way that we weren't before. Very recently in history, right, say before the Vietnam War is probably a good time period, we had very little access to know what the rest of the world was like. But to say that, say if we were to take a percentage, the bottom 50% of the world in terms of net worth, to pick one variable, to say that has their living standard has gone down over the last 40 years is ridiculous, right? Like, you think about Africa, right? Smartphones, M-Pesa, the ability to transfer money, the ability to engage in commerce, all that sort of stuff. Their life is still terrible, don't get me wrong, right? And I'm not saying that the wealth disparity gap is shrinking, but objectively speaking, their living standard is going up. And that is at least in the right direction. Doesn't mean it's as good as it should be. Doesn't mean that it shouldn't be, that gap shouldn't be closing faster, or that could, all that sort of stuff is extraneous to this particular point. The point is that pretty much everyone in the world is getting a better life day by day, right? There's some local variations on that, but we're going in the right direction, and this is the biggest problem to solve. If you're, no one in the world knows how to take 3.5 billion people and both educate them and uplift them in terms of living standards in a matter of years or decades even. This is literally the biggest problem humanity has in terms of people, and no one knows how to solve it. Still, yeah, I mean, still, the majority of, I mean, yeah, the majority, look, there's a rising middle class in China because there has to be to support industrialization and knowledge work and things like that. Oh, I'm sure there is. Well, I mean, what part of the problem is that capitalism is a very raw formation of ideas and economics and incentives and things like that. If there was a better system than capitalism that people had, it would be able to do things like produce more with a given arrangement. In every state, in every territory, in every corner of the globe. All you have to do is create a black box, and then...
If you listen to Richard Wolff, he explains it very clearly. It's in the nature of a corporation and which is the basis of capitalism, the corporation, to concentrate wealth and power. That's what they do. It's like a mathematical equation. It's not an opinion. It's what it does. That's why capitalism is as it is. And fiddling with the system, I'm all for experimentation. I think that's the best part of what you've said. But the basis of it is, please look at Google Richard Wolff. He's a professor. It's extremely good. He explains it, what capitalism is, what the corporation does. That's what we see today. We're seeing the whole ecosystem go down the tube. You can't talk about the world getting better if the whole basis on which we live is if we're bound for extinction. It can't possibly be right. We're better and better. We're completely destroying the planet, the livable planet. It can't. Both things cannot be true.
Yes. So Queensland will have free reign to mine, because if one state saves a little bit, then Queensland gets to pollute a little bit more, and I mean that's the whole thing with Malcolm Turnbull's new target. So one wonders if one does have decades, well, probably decades, but there's a lot of things that need to be fixed up. But inequality is definitely getting worse. No. Steady state theory. Steady state UBI seems like Guy Standing's ideas. We are 40 minutes over time, folks. I think we need to wrap up now. I'm sensing that Max is just itching to say one last thing, but before he does, it's my job to announce the topic for next week. So it is the Russian Revolution. So where's Jefferson? Is he gone? So it's the Russian Revolution and its relevance today. And Kieran Howard will be chairing that one. If he turns up and remembers, he was supposed to chair tonight. A total schmozzle. But thank you very much for your strong engagement tonight. And I will let our Max, it's the first time he's been here and he's got plenty of really interesting things to say. So I will give Max the last word. Thank you very much.
I feel like I should probably shut up now before I get myself too much in trouble. But needless to say, I probably have some alternate views to what the canon has been here tonight. I mean, you know, I think things like our ability to clean up the environment is contingent on the availability and price of energy. Like, the more energy we have, the greater our ability to clean things. You know, I think that, largely speaking, we live probably in roughly the cleanest environment that humans have ever lived. In terms of hygiene, in terms of the quality of air, things like that. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some terrible examples, right? As in, like, Beijing is awful. But when you think about things like the London smog at the, you know, with the Industrial Revolution, London's better than what it is now. Do you mean Newcastle is in, like, up the coast sort of thing? And I get, well, I mean, look, asthma's still, at least in the, so I grew up in the Hunter Valley, by the way, and asthma's, I think the rate is 3 to 4 times higher than normal. But that's not going to increase. You know, we have more and better technology. We're going to be able to deal with that better. We're more aware of the problems. We have better detection things. And I'm not arguing that companies are somehow becoming altruistic magically. Like, no, of course not. There's got to be other influences there. But you know, they still perform an important role in our economy. They still do stuff that's important. And if we just got rid of them today, we'd be worse off for it. We need other things first. And, you know, it's not like there's one clear winner right now. If there was one clear winner, then we wouldn't need subsidies. People would just make it if we're talking about energy. Personally, I'd really like to see us start investing in research into nuclear fusion, because we're getting, you know, even though it's been 20 years away for the last 60 years, we're getting closer and closer. And nuclear fission technology is far, far cleaner than it used to be. That's good stuff. We should be producing more of that. And that, if we want to move away from fossil fuels, then that's the least we should be aiming for, because the potential there is just so much higher than it. What about the rare earth metals and everything else that needs to be mined for that? Like, look, in 7 years, in 14 years, roughly speaking, the cost of solar power halves every 7 years, I think. That's great. Right now, we're talking on par stuff. In 20 years, it's going to be fantastic, but everything else will be as well. Solar power is okay. There's a lot of side effects that we don't take into consideration. Yeah, that's the gist there. But the thing about nuclear power is it works everywhere in the solar system. It works like everywhere on the planet. It's 100% reliable. We've got fantastic contingency plans. Yeah, it's called the other side of the Earth as well. Like, you know, I mean, what are you proposing that we build lithium-ion batteries that takes like rare earth metals, that is an amazingly destructive mining process, to just make up for the fact that solar panels don't work half the time? Whereas if we have, for example, liquid thorium reactors, they work 24/7. They physically can't melt down. There's other good stuff. Anyway, I'm getting the wrap up from multiple people, so we should probably continue. Oh yeah, no, fantastic. That's great. This is it's part of the problem with regular nuclear power as well. Is I think we have treaties from the 60s and 70s that prevent us reprocessing stuff. Anyway, let's shut up. Let's clean up all that sort of stuff. We'll talk over a pint at the table.